For some of you here tonight, this may be the first time that you've had the opportunity to hear truth about what's really happening in Europe, about the death of freedom of speech that's just occurred. There's so much, even some things that came across Facebook today that if I'd had a little more time, I would have shared some of it, because I was shocked at some of the stuff that's going on here in the States already. I think it was in Minnesota, they have now set up a hotline for people to report people who are speaking against Islam. This is happening so quickly in our country. When you work in this field, it's challenging on so many fronts, because truth sometimes is a thing people don't want to hear. Because you see, you have to take responsibility for it when you hear it. You have to deal with it, make decisions based on it, and therefore ignoring or pretending it doesn't exist becomes a desired out. So their beautiful life bubble, doesn't burst. Either you will learn truth and take responsibility for it, or truth will be forced on you, and you won't have the choice left to make. And we're at that point today in so many arenas. Elisabeth Sabaditsch-Wolff is the daughter of a diplomat. Austria is her home country. Her father was in the United States a good bit while she was growing up. So Elisabeth came to know America and our language, our Constitution, and our customs in her early years. This is when her love for the States began. As many of you have heard me say, Elisabeth managed to be at all the wrong places at just the right time to be on the front lines of what has been history for the last 40 years. I really encourage you to go, if you haven't already listened to my interview with her, because I knew nothing about Elisabeth, and I was interviewing her, and I was in tears before we finished the interview, because I couldn't imagine what she has gone through. And that's still on the Christian Reporter News website. But anyway, she brings a most unique perspective and reality to the table for all of us. Elisabeth is a fighter for freedom. You see, Elisabeth was arrested for speaking truth at an event. She was discussing Muhammad, the founder of Islam, the man they considered to be the model of a man. One who all men should copy and imitate with their lives. She was sharing the documented fact from the Quran that he married Aisha when she was 6, consummated that marriage when she was 9, and asked her audience, what would that be called? And the answer was pedophilia. When the judge realized he was about to sentence her for speaking truth, he changed the charges against her from the bench to speaking against a nationally recognized religion. She is still fighting that conviction. Now, to the equivalent of, to what would be, I guess, in my terms, would be the Supreme Court of the European Union. And they just upheld her conviction a few weeks ago, but she's appealing it. That ruling just a few weeks ago was all the buzz. Tucker Carlson was talking about it. Every newswire that I get was all a buzz. She was the Miss S from Austria. That's how they identified her. They didn't even give her the courtesy of letting her know first. She too read it in the news. So, as they were saying all across Europe, that was the day freedom of speech died. Literally just a few weeks ago. Can happen here. It's already happening. As I mentioned when she was here in May, it had happened locally to me, to a group of law enforcement officers that I had done a wonderful training for, John Londalo did, and they rescinded their TCOL hours. We're still working on that. We have some legislators in the battle now. And it keeps happening. Now Facebook and Twitter and Constant Contact, PayPal, on and on, are canceling, cutting off anybody who is literally speaking truth about any of these topics that doesn't fit their agenda. So truth is dying. Truth is being lost. It's being denied. San Angelo, in Texas, in the U.S. Couldn't be a more timely moment for Elisabeth to be here. So let's welcome my friend, Elisabeth Sabaditsch-Wolff.
Can you all hear me? Yes, I can hear myself now. Well, Kat, when I called you, what was it, just a couple weeks ago, and I think it literally is just a couple of weeks ago, I called her up and I said, look, I got some funding to come to the U.S., and I can't come to the U.S. and not show up in San Angelo. It's just impossible. This is the third time I'm here now. I'm sure there will be a fourth and a fifth time, if you'll have me back. I love being here. I love Texas. I love San Angelo. And as you can see, I came from Austria, and it's kind of cold there now, and I'm enjoying the warm weather, so I hope you don't mind me enjoying the warm weather and wearing my beloved flip-flops, because once I'm back in Austria, that'll stop. Again, thank you, Kat, for hosting me. It's always great to be here, and I also appreciate you coming tonight. It's a Tuesday. I mean, you could be doing so many different things. You could probably be out having a wonderful dinner, or watching some TV, or spending time with your family, but no, you're here. And it's always, when Elisabeth comes to town, she doesn't have any good news. I'm looking forward to the day when I will come here and be the bearer of good news. I would like to be that, and I would also like to be able to predict good things in the future. Unfortunately, I predict bad things, both in the U.S. and Europe, and so far in my 10 years of predicting, I have always been always been right in my predictions, and I'm very sorry about that. It's certainly not fun being the bearer of bad news all the time, but as long as people don't realize what the situation is really all about, I'm afraid that the situation won't improve. Before I get into my legal battle, for those of you who do not know who I am, who haven't watched that wonderful interview that Kat did, what was it, 2 years ago? Is it 3 years already? Wow. I want to tell you a little bit about myself, how I got into this. How did a housewife from Vienna, literally a wife, a mother, until a month ago a daughter, get into this situation that I'm battling the establishment in Europe, both left and right. I have to tell you, unfortunately, this is not a battle only on the left. It's both sides of the famous aisle, and this case has taken up 10 years of my life, and looking in the mirror in the morning, I can tell that it's taken 10 years. It has taken a toll on me, but never mind. I mean, I'm married already, so I don't need to impress any men out there, no longer at least. Who am I? How did I get here? Why am I in San Angelo? I mean, I could be anywhere else, but how did I get here? I'm 47 years old, and I am the daughter of an Austrian diplomat who is now retired. I was born outside of Austria. My father's first post was in Switzerland, so I was born in Geneva. Incidentally, the same hospital where Sophia Loren had her son, so must have been quite a nice hospital, I don't remember. And, but my mom told me about that. So, we moved to New York City in 1975. One of my basically my first language was English. I attended kindergarten. I think I even pledged allegiance back then because I didn't know any better that I was an Austrian, but it didn't matter, it didn't hurt me. New York, we left New York in 1977 to move to Iran. And I, as a 6-year-old, got to know an Iran that was fairly Western-oriented. It was under the Shah still, under the Emperor of Iran. Nobody says that the Shah was a saint, that he was perfect. But in an eerie parallel to Gaddafi, who certainly wasn't a saint either, a very stable country compared to what we are witnessing today. And the same thing can be applied to Iran. It was a fairly stable country. Of course he was a tyrant, and I'm not making any excuses, but if you compare Iran before the Shah was deposed and Iran after, I think many of you would agree that today there's hell on earth, especially for women, in Iran. I went to school in Iran, attended 1st and 2nd grade, and until one day the Ayatollah Khomeini returned and riots broke out prior to that. And the reason I'm telling you this is because this has had a lasting effect on me, and it is the reason why you will find so much Islam in my life. Not that I'm practicing it, but you know, my life it's all about Islam. It's kind of following me. It's been following me since 1978 or 79. And I remember vividly as a 6-year-old those riots in the streets, not being able to go to school because there were so many dead bodies in front of the school. So there wasn't enough time to remove the bodies for us to go to school. So I missed a lot of 2nd grade. And one night, my mother, my sister, and I, in the middle of the night, had to leave Iran and leave my father behind on his own because dependents were kicked out of Iran for our own safety. So my family and I were separated, from my dad for about 2 years. We could only return to Iran during summer vacation and Christmas holidays. But other than that, my parents were separated, and it was apparently a very, very tough time on my mother, probably also on my father, but my mother was probably more worried about my dad because of all the riots. And if you remember November 4th, 1979, when the U.S. Embassy was attacked and the hostages were taken, my father's office at the Austrian Embassy overlooked the American compound. And when my mother, my sister and I were in Tehran for the summer of, 1980, not only was our house burned down, we were inside, but also my mother cooked for the 2 American hostages who were held at the Iranian Foreign Ministry. And my mom had to do that during the night because there wasn't enough food, and she didn't want my sister and me to think, she's cooking food and there's nothing for us. So I also know what it's like to be hungry. There are photos of my sister looking very, very, emaciated. And, you could see her collarbone and this life in Iran showed me that you don't take anything for granted. As a 6-year-old, as a 7-year-old, I already learned that. And I also know what war is like, what up-rests are like, what it's like not to have enough food, what it's like to be afraid when you walk in the streets. My father left Iran on the last plane before the Iran-Iraq war started in September of 1980. We moved back to Vienna, and in 1982, my father was asked to fill in, for a 2 or 3 month to be ambassador to Iraq. So my family and I spent Christmas in Baghdad, Christmas 1982, 83. Very interesting experience because we did attend church service there. That was still possible back then. And I also remember that very vividly, the Christmas service, very moving. And you have to understand, 1982, 83, it was already war, 2 years of war between Iran and Iraq. Again, I lived in Iraq under Saddam Hussein. Christians were free to practice their religion. That is not possible anymore in today's Iraq. We all know Saddam Hussein was not a saint, but perhaps we should have let him stay, because what happened afterwards is even more of a disaster. But that's a story for another day. In 1983, we moved to Chicago. 4 years of Chicago. That's where the English remained with me. So I learned English twice. Once in New York City, lost it, had to relearn it. Nobody paid for our language lessons, unlike the language lessons now offered in Austria to all the so-called migrants. That was paid out of our own pockets. My parents had to pay for those language lessons so we would be able to attend school in the fall of 1983. So 4 years of Chicago. I always like to tell the story. Kat already mentioned it. 8th grade, social studies. I had to study the Constitution. I was in the middle of puberty and rebellious, and I said, you know, why do I have to study the Constitution? I was looking for my Austrian identity at the time. I had totally assimilated into American culture, but at the same time I knew I was Austrian. It was my job to be Austrian because I represented Austria along with my dad. And I couldn't understand why I had to study it. I wanted to study my own Constitution. I did study hard. I got a 73 on the test. I still have the test at home. Can't believe it. I still have it. And my social studies teacher did a fantastic job teaching us. She was liberal, of course, Chicago, but she did a fantastic job teaching us what the Constitution is all about. And I always like to tell folks that listen to me, I admire the Constitution very deeply because it's so simple that even an 8th grader can understand it. Compare that to the so-called Constitution of the European Union, which is so terribly written that even those who drafted it admit they have no clue what it says. Okay? Horrible. So I love the Constitution. I have great respect for it, especially the Bill of Rights, especially the First and Second Amendments. And it's, you know, it's only natural that I'm a free speech activist. Having grown up in the US, having studied the Constitution, I mean, where else am I supposed to go? But it would still be a long way until I understood why I was forced to study the Constitution. Fast forward, we moved back to Austria. I graduated from high school. And after 4 years of being a ski instructor, well, first, being in wrong places at the right time, I was in Kuwait in August of 1990. I was there. I got stuck in Kuwait during the invasion. One day I woke up and war was all around me. And I wasn't especially shocked because I had experienced it before. I know what it's like to be in a war. I did what everybody else should do in times, you know, when you wake up in a war. Grabbed my car, drove to the nearest grocery store, stocked up on important things, and I really do mean that. You know, canned food, stuff like that. Had the whole car full, drove back to the embassy, and I did not leave the embassy until my fellow Austrians and I were allowed to leave Kuwait about 4 weeks later. If you're interested in hearing the story about what happened to me in Kuwait, I don't want to get into this right now, but we did talk about it very extensively during our interview that made you cry. Yes, yes, yes. it was a tough time. I was 19 years old at the time, and it made me grow up very fast. And I also got PTSD, which nobody diagnosed at the time, and I had to get over it all by myself. And to this day, I don't like hearing the sound of hovering helicopters above me, because this is how Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, using helicopters. When I left Kuwait on Saddam's request in 1990, I promised myself that I would return to Kuwait, because I usually like, when I start something, I want to finish it too. And I did not finish my time in Kuwait on my own terms. So I vowed one day I would be back, and that happened in 1997. I returned to Kuwait, spent 4 years in Kuwait, immersed myself in Islam in many ways, including boyfriends. Well, it was just one. It was one before I met my husband. Met my husband, who is an Austrian, a surgeon, a military war surgeon. And I still, in 2000, I still didn't have enough. I wasn't ready to go home yet, so I added a year in Libya. Yeah. Maybe I shouldn't have done it, because it was probably the worst year of my life in Libya. It was, even under Gaddafi, it was a terrible life. You have to imagine a country. No restaurants, no cultural events, no shopping, no fitness studios, nothing. It is a country that literally offers nothing. And you have to be a very strong personality in order to survive there, because you really need, you work from 8 to 3, and then you have the rest of the day, and then you have to think about, what do I do with my life? There isn't really much. You can't go to the beach really, because it's a Muslim country. It's not like you can enjoy the beach all the time. I won't go into detail, but it was a very, very, very hard year in Libya. I was in Libya, again, wrong time. I was in Libya on 9/11, and my Libyan landlord, as I was watching TV, and I saw, all the smoke coming out of the Twin Towers, my landlord barged into my apartment. He didn't even bother knocking on the door. He just barged in and started screaming, "The Jews did it." And I was very annoyed, and told him to leave my apartment, because there's one thing I know for certain, that it was not the Jews who did it. I was more worried, more concerned that it would actually be the Libyans who did it, because I was afraid that there would be airplanes from NATO countries starting, to bombard the Libyan coastline, and once again I would be in the middle of trouble. It turned out not to be the case. I left Libya shortly after 9/11, returned to Austria, and noticed that 5 years of full immersion into Islam, I did not study any Islamic theology, which was good, because I have a very inquisitive mind, and when I start studying something, I usually like to criticize it. And that would not have been a good idea in Kuwait or Libya, despite my diplomatic status at the time. I probably would have been kicked out. But I will tell you one story that is very relevant to my court case a few years later. In the Austrian embassy in Kuwait, we had a Jordanian interpreter. He became a close friend of mine. We worked together really well, we liked each other. It was my duty, apart from issuing visas, also to check the local media, and this was before the internet became popular, so we still had those old-fashioned newspapers. 2 lousy English language newspapers that I had to check every morning. And at one point, there was an article that described Muhammad and his child bride Aisha. And I read that. And I remember I was so shocked by what I read. I jumped up, ran to Hussein's office, and I said to him, "Oh my God, Hussein, I can't believe what I just read. Is it really true about Muhammad and Aisha?" And I was expecting him to say, "Well, no, this is a lie. You know how newspapers always try to exaggerate, and it's, you know." I was hoping he would explain it to me and give me some theological background. But no, his face froze. All of a sudden, he became so angry and hissed, "Do not ever talk about this again. Don't mention it." He was almost angry for asking him, sorry. And I couldn't understand the reaction. I had no idea. I mean, now I know. Now I understand. Now that I've studied Islamic doctrine, I know what it's about. Now I understand. He needed to do that. He needed to tell me not to question it. And I said to him, well, how can a religion mandate that? How can the prophet, the so-called prophet of Islam, live like that? And he said to me a sentence that I keep hearing when it comes to Muslims and the Islamic faith. He said to me, religion is good, people are bad. But maybe it's the other way around in the case of Islam. Because I believe Islam makes people bad. People who are otherwise good people are forced to act in a way that is contrary to what our Christian God wants us, the life that He wants us to lead. You would agree, right? And I was thoroughly confused. And thank God, and I think God did have a hand in that, He did not lead me to questioning more at the time. Again, I would have gotten in a lot of trouble, and it wasn't the right time for me to question it. So, I returned to Austria. We got married. I mean, my husband and I already had been married, but we did start a family. I got my wonderful daughter, whom I love dearly, who will turn 14 in 2 weeks, and who plays such a crucial role in what I do. The reason I'm standing here is also my beloved daughter, because I'm standing here as a mother. I'm talking to you as a mother who loves her daughter and who will always protect her. And what I am witnessing in Europe with the influx of so many migrants, first, the change that I witnessed in society when I returned to Austria once a year on vacation from Kuwait. 1995, Bosnian War, lots of asylum seekers from Bosnia, most of them Muslim, of course, and I witnessed the gradual change again in society. All of a sudden, more headscarves in the streets. I remember specifically, I was riding the metro, and I was thinking to myself, it must have been 98 or 99, I was thinking, this is not my Vienna anymore. This is changing. So when the salami tactic, you don't notice it, or the frog in the boiling water, you don't notice it. That's why I'm standing here. That's why I'm telling you. You also probably are not noticing what's going on in your country, and you need someone like me and Kat, who has so many great speakers, telling you to be vigilant. And I noticed that. And so it came about that in 2008, when my daughter was already 4 years old, and I could, busy myself with something other than changing her diapers, I will now go and read from my prepared speech and tell you how I got into this mess. And the reason I'm reading it is because I need to explain this very precisely, so you understand how it happened. And then I will speak freely again afterwards. So, the situation I told you about, the influx of so many migrants into Austria, especially after the Bosnian War. So as the situation deteriorated for the last decade or so, The European Union and its member states have cracked down on free speech. The arrival of so many migrants, which I mentioned before, has accelerated the Islamization of Europe, which tends to be very unpopular among the population. An epidemic of violent crime, more rapes, and more harassment of women. I read about those rapes every single day. Not a day goes by where I read the newspaper and the most horrific cases of rapes, both in Germany and in Austria. It makes me very worried about the safety of my child. The insistence, for instance, that schools must serve halal food, the permission for male students to refrain from shaking their female teachers' hands. These are all things that citizens dislike. And may I now add that we have the problem with the hijabs, that girls are being bullied into wearing the hijabs in school by both their fathers and the brothers. For instance, we had a horrific case of a young woman from Afghanistan who wanted to live a free life in Austria and who was brutally stabbed to death by her brother. I think that case was last year. The brother is now standing trial. Hopefully he will receive his sentence. Her name was Bachti, and she did not want to wear the headscarf, and her brother executed her. But from the point of view of the European Union leaders, there's no going back. The migration must proceed. It's a necessary part of the plan of population exchange. Therefore, people must not be allowed to discuss these things, nor may they urge the leaders to make changes. Instead, the criticism of Islam and Islamization must be forbidden. The Organization of the Islamic Cooperation and the United Nations call it defamation of religion, and it has now been criminalized all across Europe. And I will tell you later how this is also happening here in the United States. So don't think it's not here and it's not going to accelerate here. So for all practical purposes, the EU is enforcing Sharia law on its indigenous residents. 10 years ago, unbelievable, it's been 10 years ago when I first began this work, the number of political prosecutions for so-called hate speech in Europe was very small. The cases could be counted on the fingers of one hand. But that number has been increasing steadily ever since and is now rising exponentially. There are now hundreds, perhaps even thousands of cases every year in which people are prosecuted for racism, incitement, and discrimination simply for criticizing Islam or mass immigration. Unfortunately, many of those prosecuted are being convicted and fined. And horribly enough, some are even being sent to prison. There are many, many cases of people being prosecuted for speaking the truth about Islam. Far too many for me to tell you about them all. I'll discuss my own case in more detail in a few minutes, but I'd first like to say a few words about a friend of mine who's being persecuted by the state. His name is Stephen Yaxley Lennon, but he's better known as Tommy Robinson. You may have heard of him. He was one of the founders of the English Defence League and was its leader for 5 years. Tommy has been brought to court by the British government numerous times. All of those prosecutions, the hate speech charges and all the others, were trumped-up affairs carried out for political purposes. Tommy's most recent conviction was for reporting outside Leeds Crown Court about the defendants in a grooming trial. Grooming is a euphemism for the sexual slavery of native British girls by Muslim gangs, mostly from Pakistan. The media and the government do their best to obfuscate what is going on in major British cities. In the space of just 5 hours, Tommy was arraigned, tried by a judge, convicted, and sentenced to 13 months in prison. 5 hours. He spent a brief period in a so-called safe prison, that is one without too many Muslim inmates, but was inexplicably moved to a prison with a large Muslim population. In order to avoid being attacked and possibly killed by Muslim inmates, he had to remain in solitary confinement. The kitchen staff who prepared the prison's food were Muslims, so in order to avoid being poisoned, Tommy had to survive on meager supplies of canned tuna and fruit that could be sent in from outside. We are all fortunate that the dedicated efforts of his legal team were able to achieve his release after 2 months. If he had spent all 13 months under these conditions, he probably would not have survived. As it is, he left prison looking like an emaciated ghost of his former self. And if you look it up on the internet, you will see that famous video where he was harassed basically by, I think it was Sky News and the BBC, and he was zigzagging through the park with his duffel bag, and he was so skinny and he looked so haggard and so full of PTSD. It was very, very concerning to those of us who knew him in a different way. He has recovered well in the 4 years since then, but he acknowledges that the PTSD induced by his ordeal is still afflicting him. Tommy will be going to trial yet again next spring. News about him spreads through the alternative media because the mainstream media uniformly demonize him as a racist thug and a neo-Nazi. He needs a top-notch legal team to do battle with the highest levels of the British judicial system, so his defense is being crowdfunded by donations from all over the world, which is another reason I'm here. I also need to do that. The real issue behind all these arrests is that Tommy speaks the truth, just like I do, about the danger to the British people posed by Islam. But he's no longer being prosecuted for hate speech offenses. The state does not want the substance of what he says to be aired in an open courtroom and discussed in the national media. Therefore, other types of infractions must be found and other charges brought. The current case against him is simply the latest example of the repressive tactics being employed by the totalitarian British state. So here's the plan. You lock up the most charismatic leader the British counter-jihad has. You put him in with his most dangerous enemies, Muslim criminals who have promised to kill him. Make sure that the guards are absent and looking the other way when the trouble starts. Then, as far as the Sharia-compliant British state is concerned, the problem has been solved. The UK, like all the other enlightened governments of Western Europe, has abolished the death penalty. But there's more than one way to kill a political nuisance. You don't have to march him up the steps to the gibbet, put the noose around his neck, and open the trapdoor under him. What is happening to Tommy Robinson is capital punishment by alternative means. And before I get to my own case, I need a sip of water. In early 2008, I began a series of seminars in Vienna under the auspices of the Austrian Freedom Party, which is currently a member of the coalition government in Austria. But 10 years ago, that was very, very far away from happening. And I was explaining to members and other interested parties what Islam, the Quran, and the Hadith really teach, along with the basic tenets of Islamic law. My seminars were fully sourced PowerPoint presentations, fully sourced. In my presentations, I discussed the consequences for democracy, freedom, and human rights today. For the next year and a half, the interest in my seminars grew and attendance increased from 7 to 30 people. So, well, it was 10 years ago, okay? I paved the way for more and more people to be interested in the subject, but 10 years ago, I was doing the groundwork, basically. The success of my lectures drew the attention of the Austrian leftists who were determined to discredit and destroy the work of those who criticize the tenets of Islam. To them, we are racist, fascists, and Islamophobes. Unbeknownst to me, the left-wing magazine called News sent a reporter to one of my seminars to make a surreptitious recording of it. As a result, in late November of 2009, a criminal complaint was filed against me for hate speech. From an Austrian left-wing point of view, my offense was compounded by the fact that my seminars were held under the auspices of the Freedom Party. Despite its popularity with the Austrian voters, the Freedom Party is or was reviled as xenophobic by the leftist media and other politicians. The complaint against me was not filed by the state, but rather by News Magazine, the publication whose reporter had infiltrated the seminar. And also, if I may add, not a single Muslim complained. This was not filed by a Muslim who felt that I had denigrated him, okay, or I said something he didn't like. No, this was our people. It was a young girl who did this, and she was used by News Magazine to do this. For the next 10 months, the possibility of a formal charge was left hanging over my head, but I received no official word about what might happen to me. All I could do was retain legal counsel and wait. In April of 2010, I gave a deposition to the Office for the Protection of the Constitution and the Prevention of Terrorism. After that, there was nothing, silence, from the prosecutor's office. Finally, on September 15, I learned that a formal charge would be filed against me. A few days later, I received official notice from the court, and my trial was set for November 23, 2010. During my trial, the issue of pedophilia came up. In light of Muhammad's status as the perfect example for Muslims, as stated in Quran chapter 33, verse 21, I also explained what the Hadith collections are, and that they constitute an indispensable part of Islamic scripture. I emphasized that I had made up none of what I said, but simply quoted canonical Islamic scripture concerning Muhammad's conduct, including his marriage to a little girl named Aisha. The trial was then adjourned until the following January. At the second hearing, excerpts from the seminar recordings were played back, demonstrating very clearly that the original charge of incitement to hatred was completely unjustified. And we did not listen to 12 hours, okay? It was, after half an hour, it was completely, the judge said, no hate speech. The judge then discussed my statements that the conduct of Muhammad is exemplary for Muslims and took particular issue with the following statement. What, and I'm quoting myself here, what would this behavior be called today if not pedophilia? Which was a reference to the Prophet's marriage to a 6-year-old girl. Now, you will read or hear in the mainstream media that a woman named E.S. called the Prophet Muhammad a pedophile. I did not do any such thing. I did not say Muhammad was a pedophile. I knew that would get me in trouble. So what I did was search for another word. I was looking for a synonym. How do we describe a behavior of a 56-year-old man marrying a 6-year-old and consummating the marriage when she was 9? That's all I did. No hard feelings, later on the courts would decide that it was my intention, as if they knew what was going on in my head at the time. It was my intention to degrade and vilify the Prophet Muhammad. So evidently aware that the charge of incitement to hatred was never going to fly, the judge, at her own discretion, eventually announced a new charge. And the charge is called denigration of religious teachings to a legally recognized religion in Austria. This must sound very foreign to you. Islam, along with other religions such as Christianity, the different denominations of Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, I think Hinduism is also legally recognized, is a legally recognized religion called criminal the criminal code. My defense was unprepared for this and requested that the trial be adjourned. When the court reconvened in February, events moved very swiftly to a close. The judge decided that the language in my seminars did not incite hatred, but the utterances regarding Muhammad and pedophilia were punishable. In particular, the judge found that the use of pedophilia was factually incorrect. And listen to this. As this is a preference solely or mainly directed towards children. The judge stated that this cannot apply to Muhammad, who was still married to Aisha when she attained the age of 18. Thus, I was found not guilty on the count of incitement to hatred, but guilty on the charge of denigration of religious teachings of a legally recognized religion, to be punished by a 480 euro fine, approximately 500 dollars, or 60 days in prison. Now let me explain to you. You might think, or you will probably think, well, it's just $500. It's not a lot of money. The way this fine was calculated was in day fines. I received 120 day fines, which translates into 1/3 of the maximum sentence. The day fines are calculated based on your income. Since I lost my job and therefore had no income, I received the lowest possible day fine, which is 4 euros a day. Imagine if I had held a job and the judge would have, calculated my income, and it would have been 100 euro day fine. Do the math. And it's important that you note that it's only 480 euros, because this will come up in the judgment of the European Court of Human Rights again. The charge on which I was convicted was ludicrous on the face of it. Not only did I never ever say that Muhammad's actions constituted pedophilia, but Muhammad's actions, which were undisputed by the court, included having sex with a 9-year-old girl. If I had said what I was accused of, it would have been nothing more than the simple truth, and unremarkable to any normal, sane person. I appealed my conviction to a higher court. In December 2011, the verdict was naturally upheld. Later, the case was considered by the Austrian Supreme Court, which again upheld the verdict in December of 2013. Thus, exhausting my options for justice in Austria, I appealed my case before the European Court of Human Rights. On October 25th of this year, the court ruled against me. And I will now explain, without reading the speech, I will explain a little bit what the European Court of Human Rights is, because it is a court that your president would never accept. And I'm very happy about that, because it's a new supranational court that rams down terrible decisions, and I will tell you about the decision right now. So, the ECHR, European Court on Human Rights, is the highest court, not in the European Union, you must separate that, but in the area, the jurisdiction is the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe has nothing to do with the European Union. The Council of Europe extends, it does include all of Europe, but extends all the way to Azerbaijan. So you have all these stand countries. Also, you have Turkey, for instance. Turkey is a member of the Council of Europe and is currently currently not a fan of the European Court of Human Rights, let's put it that way. Turkey was actually charged to free a dissident from jail in Turkey, which of course Erdogan said, what do I care? He's not going to be freed. So anyway, it was established in 1959 by the European Convention on Human Rights, which is very, very roughly equivalent to the Bill of Rights. But then again, it's not equivalent to the Bill of Rights, because the Bill of Rights is, God gave us these rights. These are God-given rights. Nobody can take them away. The European Convention on Human Rights are rights that can be taken away, and they were taken away by the European Court of Human Rights. The court weighs, and that's important to know, weighs court decisions in individual nation states, like it did in my case, the Austrian nation state, against the European Convention of Human Rights. And it's important to know those two articles. You have Article 9, freedom of religion, and Article 10, freedom of expression. And I am a big fan of the American concept of freedom of expression, where there's only the fire that you can't scream or shout in a theater, and there's another decision by the Supreme Court with a restriction placed on freedom of, First Amendment. Other than that, I call myself a freedom of speech fundamentalist. I want freedom of speech the way it is enshrined in the First Amendment. And Article 10, freedom of expression in the European Convention, places many restrictions on freedom of expression. So it says in that convention, it carries duties and responsibilities with it. But once you have those, it's not true freedom of expression. Because each member state can write down in their own law what these limitations are. So it's not really freedom of speech, right? It's just nominally freedom of speech. You call it that, but it's an empty box. Or maybe no, it's not an empty box, it's a full box. I want the empty box. But what I get is the full box. I don't need any limitations. And I don't believe that it's correct to do that. And I want a European-style First Amendment. I will call for that until the day I die. Or there is one. I will now quote from the ruling itself. If you're interested in reading the entire ruling, I will make it available to you. You can link to it. For those of you with some legal background, you might find it fascinating and very chilling to read. It says, the court found, and this is a direct quote, the court found that the domestic courts, the Austrian courts, carefully balanced the right to freedom of expression with the rights of others to have their feelings protected and to have religious peace preserved in Austrian society, end quote. Let me analyze that. Freedom of expression is not absolute, but should be balanced, and that's what the court also said, should be balanced, one, against religious rights of others to have their religious feelings protected, two, to have religious peace in Austria preserved. So what does that mean? First, who are the others? The court doesn't mention who the others are. We all know who the others are, right? But the court doesn't mention it. The court also doesn't mention religious rights, but feelings. So it's the religious feelings of others that I need to take into account. Now, how is all this defined? The court doesn't say. And isn't every single critique that we utter more or less hurtful to other people's feelings? To which I say, get over it. I mean, seriously, there's no right for you and me not to be offended. That is not a right. According to the European Court, it is now. Second of all, what is especially creepy is that freedom of expression has to be balanced against the right to have religious peace preserved in Austria. Now, what is religious peace? There's no definition. I only know one type of peace, which is peace. But is there an unreligious peace? The court doesn't say. Critique of others may thus, according to this judgment, lead to a breakdown of the fragile peace witnessed in many European cities. So the court basically admitted, speak out against Islam and the religious peace is threatened. So what this judgment does, it defends those who threaten violence and not those, like me, who engage in debate. And that is very, very frightening. It's a very slippery slope. I will tell you one more thing. What the ECHR did, it also weighed up conflicting rights. It is one thing to give religious people the right to think, express, and practice their religion, to manifest it, or similar. But this is completely different from insisting that others must respect their religion. And this is what this judgment does. It tells us we have to respect Islam. I don't see the necessity for that. Nobody is demanding that Muslims respect Christianity. You can't ram it down people's throats. Okay? And this is also, this respect for religion is also not a right given in Article 9 of the European Convention on Human Rights. And it shouldn't be. The freedom to practice religion does not require blasphemy laws. So once I am done with the European Court on Human Rights, I will start my political activism to get rid of this terrible blasphemy law in Austria. We also have, what we're witnessing is speech policing. For instance, I make a powerful contribution to debate. You speak bluntly and perhaps a bit offensively. And Kat may be gratuitously offensive, which she would never be, but we're just pretending now, has committed blasphemy and must be hanged, or at least fined, or imprisoned. Who is to decide that? Just keep that in mind. I also want to tell you the 3 major problems with the court decision. You need to know all of this because this will happen in the United States if you are not vigilant. What I have witnessed thanks to this conviction or this decision is that in cases of blasphemy, truth is no longer a defense. We can find significant evidence, for instance, in the Hadith collections, the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, to make a plausible case for what I said during the seminar. But the court said my statements were based on untrue facts. Now, what is an untrue fact? The court did not elaborate. Either it's a fact or it's not a fact, right? Whatever it is, we can read the facts. We can read the Hadith collections. And should we therefore lie just to please the court or to please the Muslims who might be offended or maybe not? Another problem. The court has started a debate about tone. Were certain things said in an objective manner? I was supposed to have spoken in an objective manner about Islam. Why? It's as if Kat would have told me, well, you can come to St. Angelo, but you have to speak objectively. I would have said, Kat, I love you, thank you very much, but that is not what I believe in. Freedom of speech doesn't mean I have to speak objectively. It's entirely subjective. I will present my opinions. You can agree or disagree. That's how it should be, right? We should be able to talk to each other. But don't shut me down. And I won't shut you down either, because you have the right to your opinion. We may not agree, but, I won't shut you down, you don't shut me down. Furthermore, who decides what is objective? The court did not elaborate. It just chided me for not being objective. Since when am I, when I hold a seminar, who said I needed to be objective? It was not, the Freedom Party did not tell me I needed to be objective. And third, this judgment hands over the decision on what is or is not allowed to be said, not to a court, but to whomever can claim that another individual has risked the so-called peace. Again, a very slippery slope. just so you know how terrible this court decision actually is. And I could tell you so much more, but what I want to tell you, like I said, I have a lot more information on the decision, but I would like to tell you, if you think that this is not going to happen in the United States, and I say that every time I come to this beautiful country, think again. In 2012, the United Nations Human Rights Council unanimously adopted a so-called Resolution 16/18. This resolution targets speech, especially criticism of Islam, and it was this resolution was sponsored by the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which is all of the Muslim countries all over the world. It's an organization, it's the largest organization and voting bloc within the United Nations. So this voting bloc is a very strong bloc. The resolution urges states to take, and listen carefully, because this will make its way into American law, thereby seriously damaging freedom of speech, your First Amendment. It urges states to take effective measures to address and combat incidences of religious hatred, and 1618 is a call to curtail certain kinds of expressive acts. This resolution was applauded by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and she said, we need to overcome the divide and the false divide that pits religious, and I'm quoting her verbatim, that pits religious sensitivities against freedom of expression. This is what she said. And we're not talking about freedom of religion, that's what she said. She used the word religious sensitivities. Again, listen to what I just told you. Remember what I just told you about my court case? And listen to what Hillary Clinton said. Freedom of expression and freedom of religion are now pitted against each other. Very frightening. Hillary Clinton also wanted to advance 1618 by countering offensive speech. If you start countering offensive speech, you're on one of these slippery slopes to removing the power of the First Amendment. And she said, the American people do not need the government to tell them what to abhor or find offensive. But that's what she did. And imagine if she had become president. This Resolution 1618 is in the drawer to be pulled out again as soon as Hillary Clinton or anyone else, let's put it that way, for any Hillary Clinton to come along. It doesn't have to be Hillary personally. Okay? It will be pulled out of the drawer. You can be certain of that. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation says the following. I, the Secretary General of the Islamic Cooperation, I am a staunch supporter of freedom of speech. But, and once you hear the word but, it's erased everything. He says, freedom of expression does not entail insulting others, denigrating others, or mocking others. Well, who decides what that means? Islamic law is very clear about that. Slander in Islamic law means anything that is said that could offend a Muslim. Right? It says so in the Reliance of the Traveler. Okay, and we need to understand the difference, the way Islamic law defines slander and the way Western society or Western law defines slander. It's completely different. In the US, you also can't defame the dead. So my case would not have gone to trial in any case, here in the United States. I also want to tell you before I continue, or almost finish up, because we need to have some serious Q&A. I came across a very frightening survey from here in the United States, and we as I'm not American, but Americans are staying silent out of fear. And it's a very, very interesting survey. So why aren't people talking? Why aren't more people in this room? Why are people afraid of coming to events like mine? Why are people not speaking out? Well, it's very interesting. It says here, up to 66% of Americans agree that there is pressure to think a certain way about sensitive topics like Islam or Muslims or immigration or homosexual marriage. 66% of Americans, that's 2/3 of the people living in this country, that there's pressure to think a certain way. 68% say it is acceptable for me, agree with the following sentence, it is acceptable for me to express what I think about race or Islam only among people who think like me. 80% see hate speech and political correctness as problems plaguing American politics. Millions of Americans routinely lie or dissemble about their political opinions out of fear. I think this is a very frightening, I mean, we have to, to quote Brigitte Gabriel of Action for America, we really need to throw PC into the garbage where it belongs. Yeah? And I fear for your children and my daughter, because I already have to tell her when she goes to school, she needs to censor herself. And I can give you a very concrete example of that. She had a German exam recently. She got the grade today, it was a B. She was not very happy. It was a B+++, but it was still a B. And it was wait a second, my hair. It was a 2-hour written exam, and she was given two topics to choose from. And she told me afterwards, well, the first topic I couldn't pick because it was a political topic targeting so-called right-wing extremists. And she said, I'm not going to get into that in school. So she picked the other one, self-censorship. Okay? This happens all the time. So, I will now finish up. On October 25th, I didn't mention that, October 25th of this year, and the date is important because I now have a 3-month window of opportunity to appeal one last time. On October 25th of this year, the court ruled against me, as I told you, in reaching this decision, and I'm going to repeat that because it's so important. The court said it carefully balanced the right to freedom of expression with the right of others to have their religious feelings protected, and that its decision served the legitimate aim of preserving religious peace. The ECHR's decision has repercussions that extend far beyond Austria. The same reasoning about preserving religious peace may be applied to any country that falls under the court's jurisdiction. And since Islam is the only religion that is ever likely to violate the peace when it is insulted, the court has effectively imposed Islamic laws against blasphemy throughout Europe. In other words, it has instituted Sharia. And this is precisely the reason why I have decided to appeal the decision to the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights. That is the last avenue of appeal, and it is my very last shot. And I will do it. My lawyer is currently working on that. But it is expensive. It's very expensive because he has to read up on very, he only has a 3-month window, and he has to read up on all the cases, read up on the case law. And apart from the 2 instances, well, I told you only one, Resolution 1618, but there's another one, House Resolution 569, that basically apologizes to Muslims for the terrible plight that, is afflicting them here in the United States, and I'm being very facetious now. You may be asking yourselves, why should I care about what has happened? What is happening in Europe? These things are thousands of miles away and an ocean in between. And just, let the Europeans worry about it themselves. It doesn't concern us. Wrong. There are practical reasons why what happens in Europe should be of concern to Americans. The first is, the more Muslims there are in Europe, the more Europe is a security threat to the United States. You have the Great Jihad that is about to jump, or is already sort of jumping over to the United States. There are stockpiles of nuclear weapons and other advanced armaments in Europe. And there are also far too many Muslims in the ranks of the military in France and Britain. What will happen when the tipping point is finally reached and the sleeper cells are activated? And the second problem is what you are currently witnessing at your southern border. Probably not very far away from here. Tell me how many miles? An hour and a half. Wow. Away from here. Nobody knows who has joined the so-called caravan. You don't know what kind of people are in that caravan. You don't know if there are, and I would probably wager that there are quite a few jihadists in that caravan, so-called caravan. Just as we had the Paris attackers in the 2015 wave of illegal immigrants making their way through Austria into Germany and then on to France and Belgium. The US and also Europe have acknowledged that it is impossible to vet these so-called migrants properly. Big mistake. Big mistake. I was vetted before coming into this country when I applied for a visa. That's how it should be. Right? I came here last Wednesday. I presented my passport. I said, this is who I am. I mean, I didn't tell them the entire truth. I said I was going to spend Thanksgiving with friends of mine in Dallas, which is the truth. And I was welcomed into this country. And that's how it should be. This country is so welcoming. But you shouldn't take advantage of it. Come here legally. If you come here illegally, in my opinion, you are a criminal. You have no right to be in this country, or any country for that matter. I want them out of Austria. I know this may not sound very nice, but nice is no longer an option. Make sure you talk to your elected officials about what is happening, put pressure on them. I'm sure you're doing that. And realize that Europe's present is America's future. I keep saying that, but it's so true. And remember, I said that before, I think I said that, or maybe I said it in an interview. The United States saved Europe from National Socialism so many years ago. You're gonna have to do it again. Europe is counting on you. We need you. But we do not need we can't work, or we can't be saved by a weak United States. You've got to be strong. You've got to be strong for your brothers and sisters in Europe. We're looking to the United States. So, to finish up for tonight, I urge you, as I always do, to exercise your fundamental constitutional rights while you still can. Speak up and speak out against what is happening at every opportunity. Thank God for the First Amendment. As I told you, we don't have anything like that in Europe, and I wish we did. And thanks to the Bill of Rights, prosecuting dissenters is much more difficult here in the United States. Don't think it can't happen. It is happening, but it's more difficult. Thank God also for the Second Amendment. Most Europeans have no ready access to legal firearms. And of course, that poses a challenge when the migrants assault you. My government has recently passed a law that immigrants may no longer carry arms, and they also may not carry knives. We do have a very high number of knifings. I don't know if the law is smart. We'll just have to wait and see. So I implore you as American citizens and patriots, hang on to your hard-won rights. The Constitution, despite Trump, is being taken away from you bit by bit. Take action while you can, because the deep state is still making its way. It's still pushing and pushing and pushing. It's the same thing in Austria. We have a center-right government, but the deep state is very active. So don't become complacent. You are so fortunate to live here in the United States, but there are, of course, large forces arrayed against you. Your enemies, and many of whom are right here in the United States, you know that, make no bones about what they intend. They want to eradicate American exceptionalism and make the U.S., just like Europe, a subjugated state. Even President Trump is no guarantee that your freedoms will remain. The march through the institutions has been very successful. The same is true of the new Austrian government. The personnel may have changed, but the left is still very strong. People, especially young people, and unfortunately, except for Brandon and Kat, I see very few young people in here, and I wish there were, have been and are still being brainwashed by the media, by the educational system, and by non-governmental organizations. And this is very true on both sides of the Atlantic. As for me, and I am repeating myself, but I have to say it every time, you know me by now. I will continue to speak the truth no matter what. I owe as much to my daughter and her children and children's children. No matter the final outcome, I want her to be able to say my mommy, did everything she possibly could. And Europeans and Americans, we share a common heritage. We must hang together or we will surely hang separately. And ladies and gentlemen, I urge you to stand with me and for freedom of speech, and of course, never surrender. Thank you.
Go to one of the mics. We'll start Q&A.
Or are you so shocked that you have no questions? Come to the
We need to get the
microphone.
mic because we're recording, John.
May not need a mic for me.
Yes, we do.
Are all these people in positions of responsibility in the government in Austria and EU, all of it, are they just spiritually blind? Are they too stupid? Are they being paid off like Hillary? The Arabs had given her $20, $30 million. So is that the way it is?
It's this is a question I get all the time, and it's a question that in all those years that I've been in this type of work, have not been able to answer, because we simply don't know. We don't know what goes on, and there's many reasons that we can come up with. None of the leaders in Europe. You look at our own Chancellor Sebastian Kurz, you look at Emmanuel Macron, you look at Theresa May, you look at Angela Merkel. None of these leaders have children. None of these leaders has children. Yes? Yes? Think about that. So what have they got to lose? Okay? So, maybe one reason. You always have George Soros in the background. Now, criticism of George Soros and his Open Society foundations are now almost prohibited in Austria and in Europe as a whole, because this criticism is currently being equated with anti-Semitism. No one talks about George Soros being Jewish. Nobody. But the establishment now says criticism of George Soros equals anti-Semitism. So people are silenced. You don't want to be labeled an anti-Semite. It's, I don't care what he is. He could be from Mars. I don't care. I know that what he does is not good for our societies, both in the United States and in Europe. And anti-Semitism, his being Jewish, has nothing to do with it. I couldn't care less. Really.
You mentioned that in Minnesota they've got a hotline for anti-Islamic comments. The new Attorney General is Keith Ellison,
I know.
who was the first Muslim in Congress, the Vice Chairman of the Democratic Party, and that there are now 4 Muslims in Congress. So you're right, it's beginning. And I had predicted that his first move would be against free speech. Ellison's first move against free speech. I didn't think of a hotline, but it comes down to the same thing.
It's snitching.
Yes.
Yep, that's what it is.
Yeah.
It's snitching, and we should, this is, I keep using the word frightening, but I'm actually very afraid.
Yeah, it's terrifying.
It's terrifying that we are now, that you are living in a society where this, just wait until this is replicated in other states. Plus, you didn't mention, maybe you don't know, but maybe you just forgot to mention it, that thanks to Ilhan Omar, a 131-year-old law is being changed in Congress so she can wear her headscarf.
Yes.
Okay? Creeping Islamization. This is what it is. Okay? If Ms. Omar respected the law of the land, she would not demand, she doesn't require, she demands that Congress accommodate her so she can be different from everybody else. That's not the way to do it, in my opinion, here in the United States, right? What did you say? Equality for all? Doesn't it say that? But equality for you, for me, but not for her? I reject that. Any other questions? Or are you still so baffled?
I have a big mouth, you could probably hear me from over there, but
But
anyway.
the camera can't.
Oh, anyway, what can we do? I mean, we can talk to our officials, and we talk to our people here in our officials, and they say, oh, we know, we are doing all we can, okay?
More pressure? If I were in the United States, I would be, well, they probably wouldn't want me here in the U.S. I would be so much more active. I mean, one project I think is really good, is Roy White's project, The Truth in Textbooks. You got to start somewhere, and we need to start teaching our children true history again. I think we have to reclaim our children. That's one. And I use the word reclaim on purpose. Our children are being taken away from us. We have childcare in Austria starting at the age of 0 weeks, basically. My sister started work about 4 weeks after she gave birth, and her kid, her girl, was in all-day daycare. Either you're a mom or you're not a mom. That's my opinion, my personal opinion. I see that children in daycare in the hands of the government is probably one of the biggest problems that we have. We need to have our children back where they belong, with their families, not with the government. Again, Truth in Textbook, I think, is a wonderful project that should be supported far and wide. That's what I truly believe. Again, you still have the opportunity to petition your government, your lawmakers. We do not have that. So you need to be a force out there.
Have you been able to speak to like any of the Congress or the Senate?
Here in the U.S.?
Yeah.
Yeah, I usually do, yes.
They do listen?
They listen to me, yeah.
Well, that's good.
Yeah. Even though they give me time, even though I can't vote for them.
Yeah.
Well,
Well, that's good. I didn't
No,
know
they
if
do.
they
Yeah,
would
yeah,
listen
yeah,
to you
yeah,
or
yeah.
not.
No, I don't have a problem with that. What I do find a great challenge is to get the word out in Austria and in Europe, because the system of government is so different in Europe. A member of parliament in Austria couldn't care less about me as a voter. So getting them to listen is almost impossible. If you want some good news, I think at the end tonight, it's 8:11, I do have some good news, as a matter of fact. You all know, or maybe you don't, but if you don't, you should really read up. I don't know if you've written about it, maybe you also should. The Global Compact on Migration. You need to do something. You need to inform people. But let me explain what the Global Compact is first. It's a United Nations compact, a non-binding agreement to regulate irregular migration. You see what's wrong with that? Do you also understand why President Trump immediately said, we're not part of that? Viktor Orban followed him, Hungarian Prime Minister, followed Trump's footsteps right away. Austria, along with all the other countries in the world, did not. Until my closest colleague and confidant in Austria and I went and had a meeting with the Deputy Foreign Minister in July of this year. And we explained to him what the Global Compact was all about, and why it was dangerous, and why the new government must not sign it. He had no clue. I don't know why. I don't understand it, so don't even ask me. I don't know why. Lucky for the Austrian people, I also got a job working for the Foreign Affairs spokesman of the Austrian Freedom Party. And with the help of this spokesperson, we were able, my colleague and I were able to put pressure on the Austrian government. And remember, this started in July, and now it's November. And what was it? Was it before my mother died or after? I don't even remember. I think it was September, late September, early October. The Austrian government decided it would leave the Global Compact, thanks to our lobbying. I'm not done yet. You can applaud, you can clap later, I'll tell you more. Thanks to Austria, we now have Slovakia, the Czech Republic, Poland, Israel, Japan, Australia, and I just got a text message from my colleague who, for the last 2 days, was in Slovakia, working on the Slovakian government. He told me Slovakia has decided not to sign the Global Compact. Okay? This is the work of 2 Austrians inside Austria petitioning, working hard to get the government to realize what is happening. And we don't have an American system where we can go it's just by pure luck that I got this. It's only a $500 job, so I don't have, it's a tax-free job. Okay? So I don't do much. I advise him, this member of parliament. But thanks to him, we were able to do that, and that is very good news. So more and more countries, the Global Compact is supposed to be signed, I think December 10th, 13th, something like that, in Morocco. And more countries are deciding to opt out. Now, I won't go into the details because time is running out, but I would, if you could, I think we should, it would be important for people, we could, okay, okay. Global Compact on Migration, it's called. Very, very dangerous because it legalizes irregular migration. Among other things, it's evil. It's pure evil, this compact. And it has surfaced only in the last few days that Angela Merkel was a driving force behind the drafting of this. Okay? So some good news at the very end. I don't have a lot of good news, but this is good news. Okay? One last.
I still had a question. Ginger, do you have a question?
Yes, one last question. I think we should finish up. If this is the last, do we have
Just
one
a
more?
comment.
Yes.
Quick comment. The ex-Muslim Christian pastor, refugee from Iran, was arrested for sharing his testimony in Minnesota at the mall.
I remember that.
Yes, and he was taken away in handcuffs, and without any water, he was handcuffed to a metal chair for 4 hours, and later charged with trespassing because he was sharing God's word with Muslims. And they arrested him in the Mall of America. So it's in America.
Yeah, I know. I remember the case. Do we know what happened to him?
It doesn't say.
It does. Oops. Maybe.
He was on Saturday, August 25th, with an elder from one of the churches and with the elder's 14-year-old son. Shortly after entering, let's see where, wait a minute, let me get to the bottom. It doesn't really say. It just,
Yeah, because I remember not
goes into
reading
the
any.
information.
I don't know what happened to him. But thank you for bringing this up because this is also another example of creeping Islamization of the United States. Do you have one last question?
One more comment. The biggest problem we have here is that people have absolutely no idea what Islam is about.
Yes.
And every time
Yes.
you try to talk to people about Aisha being married at 6 and consummated at 9, people, I don't want to hear it.
Yes. Yes.
And we're going to have to learn to be unpopular and feed people information they don't want to hear so that they can use it later.
I completely agree with you, and you know, you can try to ignore Islam, but Islam doesn't ignore you. That's the problem. Okay, so I will finish up thanking you for coming tonight. Pray hard. The deadline for the appeal is January 25th. Again, if you got those little business cards, hopefully you can follow me on different social media platforms until I get defunded and kicked off. Who knows? Remember also that the lawyer is expensive. He's doing his best. He's also a judge on the Austrian Constitutional Court, so he is the best. And this is not about me. This is about you, all Americans and all Europeans. And as I said in my speech, you know, if we don't stick together, we will hang separately, and we don't want to do that. We need you, Americans, to be a strong country with a strong constitution and strong freedom of speech, and a strong military, of course. And I hope to be back, not only because I want to be back, but hopefully I, for once, will have good news. You know, we can pray hard, please. I don't know when this case will be, my appeal will be decided, and even if it fails, even if it's struck down, I will continue my work because I will attempt to remove the blasphemy paragraph that I was charged under. So that is my work is cut out. Okay, thank you very much. Drive home safely. And thanks again, Kat, and thanks again to you for opening this wonderful church. And I hope to see you soon. Drive home safely.